When we observe data for a statistical study of any sort, we're thinking about wanting to use those data that we're observing in order to draw conclusions about a population, and maybe more specifically about a parameter in a population. A key question that we need to be able to address when we are trying to do this process of statistical inference is, what types of data have we actually observed? What are the types of variables that we're thinking about working with? Because depending on the type of variable that we want to use or that we've actually collected, the methods that are available to us in order to use those variables or to use that data are going to differ, right? So it's important for us to identify what kind of variables are we actually observing. And so the type of data that we observe is going to dictate what methods we can use to analyze it, to draw conclusions from it, to ask questions of it. Okay? And so knowing the different types of variables is going to be important for choosing statistical methods that are appropriate for the data that we actually have. And so broadly, there are two main categories of variables. Either we're going to have qualitative variables or quantitative variables. At a high level, qualitative variables are those that are non-numeric, and quantitative variables are those that are numeric. Right? And so a qualitative variable, any non-numeric quantity, and it's going to be typically capturing things that are descriptors or categories. Right? So if you can categorize it, if you can explain it with a short bit of text, if you can put it into some group somewhere, that's typically going to be qualitative. Quantitative variables, anything that's numeric, right? If you're assigning a number to it, then it's going to be quantitative, right? Sometimes you might be sort of in a toss-up between, are the numbers actually numbers or are they really just category labels, right? And in those cases, maybe it's not entirely clear whether you have quantitative or qualitative, right? But for the most part, if it's a category, if it's a descriptor, if it's a piece of text, it's qualitative. If it's a number, it's quantitative. Now, quantitative variables themselves can actually be further divided, right? And so we can either think about discrete or continuous quantitative variables. A discrete quantitative variable is going to be any variable that takes on a countable number of possibilities, right? And so the possibilities can be enumerated. So when we say that it's countable, what we really mean is that you could start to put a list together of all of the different possible options here, right? So there could be, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, right? We can put together that list. We can actually label them in order, starting from whatever the lowest is up to the highest, okay? Often, this is going to be the integers, right? So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. It doesn't always have to be, so you could do something like 0, 1/2, 1, 1.5, 2, and so forth. But the key piece is you should be able to write down in order the list of all of the possible options here. There might be an infinite number of possibilities, right? So there are an infinite number of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth, but we can still put them into an order, right? And because of that, we say that they are countable. We could count up how many there are, and we'd call that discrete, right? And so we can actually sort of list out all of the possibilities, or list out all of the possibilities, perhaps using, a ... to say that this pattern is going to continue. On the other hand, we have continuous quantitative variables. And a continuous quantitative variable is going to be a variable that has an uncountable number of options. And so typically we're going to be thinking about a range of possible values. So for instance, any value between 0 and 1, right? There's no way that we could start to list out all of these possibilities, right? We could list out some of them. We could have 0, 0.01, 0.001, 0.0001, right? But for any value you specify, there's going to be an infinite number of those that are smaller than that value, right? And so it's always going to be the case that there are more. You could never list every value between 0 and 1, right? Or between 1 and 100, or 0 and infinity, or -10 and 5, right? But typically, we're going to be expressing these not as a set of possibilities, not as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but as a range of possibilities. So any number between 1 and 10, or any number between -65 and 32, right? Whatever it happens to be, we don't really care. If there's going to be a range of values and it can take any value in that range, then it's going to be continuous. If we have a set that we could actually list out, then it's going to be discrete. So some examples are in order here. If we're thinking about the variable that we've observed is the political party supported by an individual, right? We're always thinking, qualitative or quantitative first. And in this case, there's no specific number associated with this, right? And so because of that, it's going to be a qualitative variable. And if it's qualitative, we don't need to specify is it discrete or continuous, right? All qualitative variables are sort of treated the same way. We could ask ourselves the number of cats that are born in some litter of kittens, right? So cat is going to give birth, right? The first thing, is it qualitative or quantitative if we're thinking about the number that are being born there? And that's going to be quantitative because it's a number we're assigning, right? There's numeric quantity to it. But then we have to ask discrete or continuous. And here, right, we don't know exactly how many cats are going to be born in the litter, but we do know that it's going to be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, right? And so we can actually enumerate out the set of possible options. So that's a discrete value. So it's a discrete quantitative variable here. If we wanted to know the amount of water that's going to flow through a river or flow past a point in a river on any particular day, right, we have to think first qualitative or quantitative. And here we're typically going to be measuring this as some specific number, right? There's going to be a numeric quantity associated, and so it's quantitative, right? But then we have to ask discrete or continuous. And the point here is we can't count out the amount of water that's going to be happening there, right? It's not going to be 1 water or 2 water or 3 water, right? Instead, we're going to be thinking about actually measuring this, and it's going to be anywhere between, say, 0 and, some very large number of liters of water, and it could take any value in that range. And so because of that, we're thinking about this as being a continuous quantitative variable. If we ask for an individual's favorite color, right? There's no numbers associated here. And so because of the fact that there are no numbers, this is qualitative. Don't have to differentiate discrete versus continuous. The weight of a baby at birth. Okay. And so here, qualitative versus quantitative, there's a number here. So it's a quantitative variable. And then we have to think, is this going to be discrete or continuous? And sometimes when we're dealing with a discrete versus continuous, it comes really down to how are we measuring it, right? And so if you wanted to measure this where you could actually list out the full set of possibilities, right? So maybe they're 3,000 grams or 3,001 grams or so forth, you might think about that as being discrete. But I think normally the way we're going to think about this is the baby's going to be anywhere between, 0 and 10 kilograms, right? That's probably too wide of a range, but you can take a wider range than you actually need here. And because of that, you can then sort of think about it as being any number in that range, right? And so in that way, we could think about this as being continuous. And so normally with things like weight or time or volumes, we're going to think about them as being continuous, even if there's a way that you could write them as being discrete. So here we would think about that as a continuous quantitative variable. Now, that last example sort of points out that these are not always going to be super clear, right? You could think about weight as being both discrete or continuous, but sometimes they can be even less clear, right? And so let's consider a variable that I'm just calling education. Right? Is education going to be a qualitative or a quantitative variable? And the key point that I'll make here is that it can be both. It depends on how we measure it. It depends on exactly what we're measuring it, right? So if you're thinking about taking the highest level of education that you've obtained and you're just listing the category of that, then this is a qualitative measure, right? So you could say, I obtained high school, or I obtained an undergraduate, or I did a doctorate degree, right? In all of these cases, we're listing categories, and so that is qualitative by nature. But you might also measure it quantitatively if you gave, say, the number of years of schooling that you did, right? So I did 10 years of school, or I did 15 years of school, or however many you did, right? Then that's going to be a quantitative variable, and probably a discrete quantitative variable, right? But you might be able to think about ways of doing that continuously as well. But here, education itself is not going to necessarily be qualitative or not necessarily going to be quantitative. It's going to depend on how we actually measure education, right? So it's not inherent to the quantity. It's the quantity plus how we actually go about measuring it. Let's think about something like income. Okay, so income might even be sort of more confusing here, where again, we're going to be able to represent this qualitatively or quantitatively. And even with the quantitative expression here, we probably have a choice as to whether it's going to be discrete or continuous. So we might, for instance, list people as being low, middle, or high income. These are just groups. There's no numbers associated with them. We might have cutoff thresholds for what those numbers are, but as soon as they're placed in those groups, this is qualitative. It's just some category. Right? You might also measure it as a quantitative discrete variable if you measure their income in, say, thousands of dollars, right? So the annual income is going to be $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 or so forth, right? There you have just a set of categories you could actually enumerate over, and that's going to be a discrete variable because you could actually list out all of the possibilities. But what if you represented your income as something like their hourly wage, right? In this case, we can sort of think about the hourly wage is going to be anywhere between, say, 0 and who knows how many thousands of dollars per hour, right? But there's going to be some range there, and it could take any value between those. And so in that case, that's probably going to be thought of more as a continuous measure because we're over some full range of information there, right? And so here with income, again, it's not necessarily qualitative, it's not necessarily quantitative. It depends on how we're actually going about measuring it. And so always the variable's type is going to depend both on what is it that you're measuring, but also how is it that you are measuring it, right? And so we're always going to have a lot of choice there. Now, it's important for us to be able to know the type of the variable because we're going to have different methods that are going to be required or used to analyze whether qualitative, discrete quantitative, or continuous quantitative data, right? So the techniques that we're actually going to use to analyze variables of these different types are going to be different. And so once you've gone out and collected data, it's important to know what is the type of data I'm dealing with here, so then you can know what are the appropriate analytical techniques for addressing those data.